Okay, welcome back, everybody. So, this is our panel on Israel-Palestine, and I'm really lucky to have an amazing panel here today, including a last-minute volunteer to join us because we had the pleasure of meeting serendipity at a barbecue a few days ago. And little did I know that there is a scholar working on Palestinian-Israeli issues right beside us here. So I'll start with you only because I've just mentioned you. So Bree, welcome Bree, who is a new professor at Wilfrid Laurier University. She is also a research associate at the Columbia Group for Children in Adversity and faculty affiliate with the CPC Learning Network based at Columbia. And her research focuses on children and families, but her most recent research has been in Palestine. In Palestine, she's interviewed children and families about the experience living under Israeli occupation. Her work in Palestine has resulted in a number of peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, and she's currently co-editing a book called Children Affected by Armed Conflict Theory. So you bring a really interesting, being a clinical social worker, bringing in this kinds of view that, I have to say just from the last panel, the beauty of this place of BSIA is about getting this interdisciplinary conversation. So I'm really feel very blessed when we have this community aspect. And I have to point out that's my next door neighbor is Yehonatan. Am I saying that right, your name? I can almost say any way I want. No, I'm joking. Yehonatan Alsheh is currently a postdoc fellow. Again, is my neighbor here at BSIA, a few doors down the road, and is a PhD graduate recently from Tel Aviv University, was a postdoc after that in South Africa, and has just published a book called The Political History of South Africa in Hebrew, and it's been published by the Israeli Ministry of Defense Press and has a lot of inside knowledge, having lived in Israel your whole life, I'm assuming, most of it, so has some really good, I think, perspective on a lot of the questions that we're going to talk about. My good friend Jasmin, who has joined our department in political science, so yay! Dr. Jasmin Habib has a PhD in anthropology, an MA in international peace studies. She's the person that I get all my wisdom on about Israel-Palestine. I have to say, she's the first person I go to historically. I'm the one that she's depressed me in many instances. It's her fault. But when I teach this class, I'm always humbled by the fact that I have a colleague who's really an expert on this right next door to me as well. She specializes in transnational relations to Israel and Palestine. She's done field work in North America and Israel, which focused on diaspora Jewish relationship to Israel-Palestine. She's also working on sort of the flip of that, which is looking at Palestinian diaspora and their sense of belonging, of living in the diaspora and their belonging to Palestine. So a very interesting, unique perspective, because you can also talk about both Israeli and Palestinian society, but you also bring in the diaspora element, which is so relevant to so many of us here in the West. So thank you, Jasmin, for being here. And then my good colleague and friend, co-author as well, Dewitt, is on a way to a new path, but was for a long time CIGI Vice President of Programs and will be until, I believe, the end of next month or this month. This month. Very sad to have him leave us here. He is a longtime professor at York University in Toronto, where he still holds the position of university professor and has held numerous positions, including director of York Center's Center for International and Security Studies. Really, I think particularly in the 1980s and 1990s, you were the scholar on Canada and the Middle East. So, it's really, I'm humbled by that. But David's a good friend and will probably tell us a lot more one day about his great adventures in the Middle East. He has plenty of them, and turned to looking at Asia for a while, but the Middle East never left too far from his research interests. So we're really lucky to have David next door at CIGI, and so thank you all for being here. You guys have so much insight into this issue. Let me start by kind of getting a lay of the land of what's going on. My class just had their last week lecture of the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And, they're all nodding their heads, but, I kept telling them I'm bunching in 50 years, maybe 100 years of history in 2 classes. So, keep in mind, we can't cover everything. so much of the room knows about the history, but one of the things that we don't have time to really talk about is what's happening on the ground. How are people feeling, talking? We have just seen, I think, a real shift of Israeli politics to the right like never before. I think for those of you who have visited Israel, you've seen how that means the conversation has become so dominated by the right in a way that perhaps is uncharacteristically non-Israeli in some respects. I'd love for you guys to talk about, you know, your last visits to the region. Bree, having been to the Palestinian territories. I know Jasmin having had experience in the Palestinian territories too. I mean, what's your sense of people on the ground? Let's start with that, sort of the bottom up. And then David, I know that a lot of this is more what you hear from the political establishment perhaps, or one of the sort of the dominant narrative at the top. But let's start with the bottom up. So I'll start with you, Bree, because you really have, you know, you just came back from speaking to mothers and to children. What's going on the ground?
Sure. Well, I'll just preface that by saying it was about 2 years ago that I was last there, and as Bessma has said, things change so quickly. At the same time, things can also stay the same. Something I noticed on the times that I visited there is that there's really, and I'm talking from the Palestinian perspective, which was the focus of my research, there is a lot of hopelessness, to be honest. I hate to say that. You know, I'm a social worker. We believe in strengths and challenges and positive, positivity and moving forward. But there was a lot of hopelessness in terms of the families that I spoke with. Families are they're very involved in politics. They're very engaged in what's going on. And this translates down to their children. Somebody said children speak politics from the day they're born in Palestine. And I saw this, I could see children were really engaged with what's going on around them. So politics is at the forefront, and I think it always has been, at least for the last several decades, for Palestinians there. At the same time that there's kind of this hopelessness that things aren't going to change, I also noticed that there were little glimmers of hope in the interviews that I did with families and with children. And this was something that I was trying to capitalize on, trying to see what that is, so how can we kind of focus on these things. And some of the things I saw was people were very optimistic about the U.S.'s role. And I think this is where the politics, well, this is definitely where the politics comes in. A lot of families said, we really have a lot of hope that the U.S. is going to, pressure Israel to, do something in our favor, basically, was the gist of it. So those like glimmers of hope were right there. There's also just a hope that, the Palestinian families that I interviewed were very much connected to the land, connected to place, connected to their communities, connected to their families, connected to history, connected to politics. All of these things are so rooted in, which I think gives them a lot of hope that things will change. So it's a constant back and forth, I'd say, in the interviews. In one family would be talking about how horrible it is, how much they're struggling, and then the next sentence they say, but we have a lot of hope for the future. So it's very challenging as a researcher also to hear that, because it's hard to understand where they're getting at. But it's a lot of, I titled my research Contradictions in Place, because I saw so many of those contradictions there, so many of those challenges within these families' narratives, I'd say. So.
And your work was in the West Bank or in Gaza?
It was in the West Bank and East Jerusalem as well. So
okay, which, from what I've heard from the social psychology things, as bad as things are in West Bank, it's just even more devastating in Gaza in terms of how this affects children.
Yeah, and when I was there the first time, it was right after the Gaza, the boat, the flotilla, and I was in the West Bank when that was happening, and so getting into Gaza would have been, it just wasn't going to happen for me to access. And the other thing is that the situation Gaza, Palestinians living in Gaza, and then Palestinians living in West Bank, and then Palestinians living in East Jerusalem and in Israel, such different, diverse experiences.
Sure,
it's almost
absolutely.
different populations in terms of a study sample population, so yeah.
Fascinating. Yehonatan, how do you see things? When was the last time you were in Israel, and how do you think, What's the sense of the people? I mean, we just saw them elect a very right-wing coalition, tight race. There's literally, we talked about this in our last class in terms of the election results. Its coalition is cobbled together with basically one parliament seat, right? I mean, really thin margins. Give us a snapshot of how things are there.
I've been in Israel just a few months back, and so the last elections were shocking in the sense that it became exceptionally clear how truly right-wing the Jewish Israeli population is. And the coalition Netanyahu was able to create, it is a very marginal one, just having the exact 61 parliament members he needs. However, it is because the ex-foreign minister, Lieberman, intentionally walked out. So it means the opposition is actually constructed from the left wing and then a highly radical right wing that was invited to the coalition and intentionally declined because of power struggles. So in no way is the thin margin indicative of the actual size of right-wing hegemony in Israel, which is very much secure.
So that's interesting. So you're saying that you think that the right-wing attitude is even larger than the election results indicate?
I think that was the message of the elections, that although the media has been mobilized in an unprecedented fashion against the right wing and against Netanyahu, there was never in Israeli history such a mobilization of the media against the prime minister and against right-wing ideology in favor of a very moderate Zionist center-left alternative. So one must remember it's not left-wing in no meaningful.
There is no left wing anymore.
There isn't.
It's getting smaller and smaller.
So first of all, we have seen the actual demographic change in Israel.
Right.
The fact that currently what used to be called the secular left Zionist is a small minority within Israel that has no sources of future growth. This is, I think, the most important part. If you will ask where the new electorate might come from, there is nowhere they can come from. We have 4 separate education systems. The only one in which possible left Zionist ideas might be taught is the one that's getting smaller and smaller, while all the others are getting bigger. What is called national religious, which is kind of national modern Orthodox, which are one of the rising forces, and in many ways the minority that is most influential, the settlers and so forth. They have their own education system. They now had, once again, the Ministry of Education. They're capable of mobilizing funds for their constituency, their education system, and in many ways, when you think of what will be, there is no way for left-leaning constituency to emerge.
Let me push you on that because, I mean, the Arab Israelis, which account for 20% of Israeli population who vote, did for the first time, did get together, right? So is that a growing demographic?
Okay, so first of all, it is a growing demographic. First and foremost, because they are underrepresented. Their participation in the election is something that can be worked at, and it has increased for the first time. They have voted in greater numbers than ever, and theoretically, it might continue to grow. And in many ways, we are now seeing the first generation of fully Israelized non-Jewish Israelis. For the first time, we are seeing the young generation that is moving into Tel Aviv, into Haifa, that is taking up jobs, enrolling in the university, completely fluent in Hebrew, passes as Jew. I think this is the first generation in which you cannot tell that they're Arabs right away. And for Israelis, this is kind of shocking.
Yeah.
This is kind of shocking for Israelis, and you will hear a lot of older generations Israeli saying, "Oh, you are Arab, but I can't tell." And it's quite shocking for them. It's
Yeah.
the first passing as Jews, and I think this has a lot of potential. It can have a horrific potential as well, because I think there is a lot of fear from this segment of the population. Netanyahu won because he was able to warn his constituency that the Arabs are voting in droves, so which, amazingly enough, is something that you can say in Israel. You can warn the population that the population is voting, something they have every right to do. So we do see, I think that this generation might be a source of hope. However, they will not support a Zionist state. So if they will change, but by putting forward a demand for a liberal, democratic state of all its citizens.
Do you think that includes, I mean, I'd love to get, because you've really talked to Israeli Arabs or Palestinians in Israel. You know, are they talking about a one-state solution, which we have talked about in our class as an academic concept, et cetera? But if they are, in a sense, the so-called demographic bomb, in the words of Olmert, right? You know, will they actually push for the one-state solution within, or are they very happy to also say to the West Bank Palestinians, no, keep the fence literally and figuratively?
You're asking me?
Yeah, it's. I
Okay.
know it's a loaded question.
Yeah, that is a loaded question. Thank you, Bessma. I think there are several things that need to be parsed out here. The Palestinians living within the state of Israel do vote, and they have created an electoral bloc, if you will. And sometimes they vote and sometimes they don't. In the most recent election they have. In past elections, they've actually opposed voting in part as a reaction to the rise of a right wing, and also in an effort to delegitimize, if you will, the elections internally. So what I see happening within the Palestinian community, and this is where my family is as well, within places like Nazareth and Haifa, is that there is both the secularized and very modern Palestinian, if you will, who are not afraid in a way that I would say the generation sort of in between was still fearful of the military, was aware of checkpoints. They're just a very different kind of generation. And the whole thing that you hear a lot about, so the startup nation that is Israel and the startup nation that is the Jewish nation. But I think what one needs to look at as well is the startup nation that is the Palestinian nation within the state of Israel. And what you see there are, in part because Israel is so segregated in so many ways, you see within, for example, Nazareth, the growth of restaurants, right? This whole kind of modern economy that is self-organized, if you will, and is very different from what it is that we saw in the past, which were these very old villages where people didn't come out, they didn't go out, they didn't dress up. Now you have a whole new generation that has money, that's very well educated, and that's going out. And they are going out not just to Tel Aviv and Haifa, but they're actually creating their own small businesses, small industries, et cetera, within the sort of Galilee area, which is primarily a Palestinian area. So I think that is having an influence, and that's partly why you can't tell the difference, as Yoni says, right? So if you're shopping in Tel Aviv, who can tell the difference between a Palestinian and a Jewish shopper? Now, there are other things that are happening within those communities, though. You do see a rise of some religious nationalism and some organizing around religious identities that has also radicalized some of the community, but it's still in the minority, though the effort to publicize this is actually everywhere, right? So it's, again, about the danger within that other group of citizens that we can't trust. So that is also having an effect. I think within the Jewish community, one of the things that I've seen happen in the course of the last 10 to 15 years is the extent to which Jews no longer have contact with Palestinians. And in the past, you would have had more contact. So you would have had contact in Jerusalem. You would have even had contact in Jaffa, Tel Aviv, certainly in Haifa. And you're seeing that segregation. And so it's not just the wall that separated, the West Bank from Israel and all that kind of stuff, but you see internal forms of segregation occurring. And for me, there's the contradiction there. So, Palestinians are entering into Jewish communities in a way that they never have before, but Jews are not actually entering into Palestinian communities in the way that they had in the past. And that, I think, is having some influence and some effect on how it is that people perceive what is the potential of a one state or two state or whatever.
David, tell us when the last time you visited the region and give us your impression on things. I mean, I know so much of this you're watching mostly from afar, but as an avid watcher of Israeli politics and the whole...
The last time I was there was in 2005. And that was when I was in Syria, actually, as well as Israel. So a couple of comments, and then a brief anecdote that hopefully gives a positive light, more optimistic light. One, I think Yehonatan's detailed analysis was right on. The only thing I would add, and that would take a long time for us to discuss, is that the right, I mean, you applied it, but we never got into it, that the so-called right is not a monolithic right. And you can't define it in terms of the classic right-left like we used to in Western social science and politics of the previous 30 years. It's a much more complex phenomenon politically and demographically. And that's, I think, an important thing to keep in mind. Second, that there have been a couple of Israeli experiences with governments that of the day seem surprisingly right-wing, and that was Shamir and Begin. But the complexities of this world are such that Shamir and Begin, when they led right-wing governments, it was a very different regional and international context. So it meant something different, and there are degrees of freedom to both take decisions or respond to decisions, or to put it in a more social sciencey way, the transaction costs. Quite different than a right-wing government of today. So that's one set of just responses to that. Jasmin made a really interesting observation in the last set of her comments about the increasing separation of Israelis and of Israeli Jews and Palestinian Israelis or Arab Israelis. One of the interesting phenomena is that in the last 15 years, I'd say Israeli Jews have become more accustomed to deal with foreign workers because it's the foreign workers who've displaced the Palestinians because of a mix of both security and political reasons. And that suggests that that could actually change again if there were either economic or legal reasons to make it happen. I don't think that's therefore a structural given. I think it's part of the agency of what is creating the politics. Now, just a positive anecdote. In the late 1980s, just about 3 weeks before the Intifada broke out, I was part of a curious group of Israelis and Palestinians and Jordanians, one or two Egyptians. It was based at Harvard University. It was underwritten by the Charles R. Bronfman Foundation, the Archdiocese of the Catholic Church of New York, a distinguished Palestinian family based in London, and the Prince of Jordan, the royal family of Jordan. And its mandate was to come together and ask what was at that time thought of as an unacceptable question to ask. What if a diplomatic solution could be structured? How would we what would be the blueprint necessary to make sure it didn't fail? So how to become a pragmatist in the midst of this torment of politics? We spent almost 3 years working on this. And of course, as is the wont in the Middle East, crises intervene and distorted results. But it was interesting because people were genuinely hopeful, genuinely hopeful. And of course, shortly thereafter, the Oslo Accords came. And people, again, of different political persuasions. Some might say naive, some might say optimistic, but there was a sense of optimism that finally the ground had been clear that you could have serious discussions around a range of things. And Canada, following the Geneva meetings, gavelled the refugee working group. There was an arms-controlled Middle East working group. There was one on energy. There's a whole series of them. And there was a sense that this could work because everyone was on side, recognizing that time was running out, and it was not public or official, but the Palestinian leadership of the day were clear that their friends were not located in the regimes of Arab governments. No Arab government wanted to do anything serious to support Palestinian opportunities, though they might speak otherwise. So they had to turn to the international community. A very different environment again than today. Okay, so let me just jump and two more comments and
Please.
then back to you. As part of the Harvard project, my role was on confidence and security building measures, and I was sent to Tunis. Well, Tunis at that time had become the headquarters of the Arab League, who'd been evicted from Cairo, and it was the headquarters of the PLO. So I spent 10 days in Tunis meeting with the leading ambassadors at the Arab League and all the leadership, except for Arafat, of the PLO. There was lots of interesting things we could talk about, but one thing that really struck me that is kind of parallel to one thing that struck me when I had discussions with my Israeli colleagues, is that the Palestinians had a very, very, very poor, if not just simplified, view and misunderstanding of international politics and the role of international organizations, and they had even a less sophisticated understanding of the democracy of Israel. Whether you think it ill or good, with problems, they didn't understand the voting, the pluralism, the competition, and the notion that you had to have coalitions. They just couldn't understand why you couldn't have, if you're going to have votes, well, damn it, there should be a majority. And if there's not a majority, go back and vote again. They didn't understand coalition building. And therefore, they didn't know how to penetrate the Israeli political system. And on the Israeli side, they knew all about international institutions. I mean, international law is their thing. But how to make it work when they're ostracized. And they didn't, at that time, have a sophisticated appreciation of not only the complexity of Palestinian politics, but they didn't have a sophisticated appreciation of the dynamics and the conflict within the Palestinian world. So,
Interesting.
I say all this because to remind us that there can be periods where you can be really optimistic. And, you know, in political science, and I'm a lapsed political scientist, having spent too much time in senior administration.
Don't say that, David.
There's this old
Once a
phrase.
political scientist, always a political
It's
scientist.
an old phrase. Crisis is catalyst. A crisis comes along,
Sure.
and it what promotes change. The problem in the Middle East is that the norm are crises. And it's very hard to distinguish between a crisis and what's background and what's something else. And the crises come from so many different places and it requires so many different kinds of actions that one of the problems is that we're not short of crises, but they don't seem to serve as catalysts for change.
That's very interesting. This is something that we've talked about in our class as well, which was, you know, so much of modern Palestinian-Israeli history has been about bad timing. You know, there's just been this confluence of things that happen that you never get that perfect storm of a moment, right? So, for example, I mean, and I'd love for you guys to jump in, but what I see here, you know, internationally, we see probably the most I think, pro-Palestinian or sympathetic, I hate that word pro something nothing, sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, the idea of really seeing a need for a two-state solution. We've never seen so much international support on that. Europe is clearly voting in that favor. We've seen the Vatican recently voting in that favor. Most interesting, I've even noticed in my visits to Washington and inside the Beltway, I mean, now you go to CFR, to Brookings, I mean, just in terms of the intellectual hub, the word Palestine, I said this to my class, is finally said. It was taboo 15 years ago. You could not say the word Palestine, right? So, there is a change globally, and yet we see within Israel this unbelievable right-wing surge, which I think is, I'd love to get your thoughts on whether or not this is demographic, because immigration has changed for Israel, right? We've seen a different Israeli, and looking at, we've talked about in our class, the Sephardic and the Ashkenazi Jews who've come to Israel. Increasingly there is a very new Israeli identity that isn't like this identity of the 1970s of Israel. So we have a very increasingly more right wing. Some of that is baggage that come with, frankly, a lot of these new immigrants who don't come from democracies. Right? I mean, so much of the new immigrants to Israel are coming from either the Soviet Union, from the Arab world, whether it's Iraq, Iran, right? So there is also a cultural phenomena that is pushing much of the society to the right wing. And in Palestine, ironically, particularly in the West Bank, they've become a lot more left, but Gaza's become much more right. So we have this, we don't have the perfect storm to get an agreement. And so we're stuck in this moment of just this fracturing, and yet the humanitarian situation on the ground, where there's going to be, I think, more potential impact of this kind of, these interests clashing is heightened. So, Yehonatan. Yes?
I wanted to ask, on your schedule here, you have 3 questions, and I don't think I'm the only person who would like to hear the answers to them.
Actually, the panel and I, we decided to kind of go a little bit off it, but we'll bring in the questions, I promise, at some point. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay, so I want to comment on the perfect storm. There is also a lack of will. So one must remember that it's not just lack of conditions, but also a genuine lack of will. I think that really looking at Israel, and I think that one of the problems of some Israelis that they're buying into their own propaganda. The fact that we keep on saying that we want peace, it's important to remember that it's a more complicated will. I think that one of the key process that is happening is this movement to the right. And if we compare it to South Africa, it was the same. South Africa has been moving more and more to the right the more they got close to 1990. So actually, South Africa was never as radical and right-wing as it was the moment de Klerk released Mandela. So in many ways, this dynamic in itself can be interpreted in many ways. However, so the fact that Israelis never, Jewish Israelis have never come from democratic countries, because why would you immigrate to Israel if you already live in a democracy? So it's not like there has ever been an Israeli living in a democracy, coming from a democracy. Well, there are a very, very small amount. It's true that the 1 million immigrants coming from the former Soviet Union have changed the Israeli political culture in many significant ways. And it's true that respect for liberal values, which was never impressive, has declined. However, Israel is a very complicated society in terms of values and so forth. I do think that there is one major change, and that is something that currently in Israel is being discussed, neo-Zionism. And this is a departure from old school Zionism, a reaction to what was called post-Zionism in the Oslo period. So this assumption that Jewish and democratic can be somehow reconciled, and they both can exist in an uncontradictory fashion. And currently we do see this assumption that it cannot work, hence the democratic factor should be somehow inferior to the Jewish element. we do see, for example, the president of Israel is actually for a binational state between the Jordan and the Mediterranean. This is his vision. So we
But not binational in the academic sense.
binational, no, one state in which everyone will have a right of vote, that will have two national movements. It's this socialist. So he doesn't have a political role. However, he does have an important symbolic role, and he is a fascinating figure. So we do see here a rise of new ways of thinking that try to take into consideration that this whole vision of a two-state solution is not something that is very clear how it will ever materialize.
Of course.
How exactly is it going to work? How will it come to be? And in many ways, why would Israel just now do that? It's a stable country, by far the more liberal and more human rights attentive than its neighborhood. Why would it? Why would it risk such gross destabilization? So I think that in terms of motivation, I think that Israelis are very attentive to why would they just now do that?
Right. Well, it's interesting. I mean, Jasmine's got to reflect this binational because she's written on this and I've learned all about binationalism from Jasmin. But, one of the response to the failure, I think, of the right wing in Israel to really come to the table in some respects. I mean, we saw Netanyahu very clearly before the election admit that he doesn't want to see a two-state solution, has been the Palestinian effort to internationalize it, right? So there's been an effort from the Palestinians, and I should be specific, the Palestinian Authority, the West Bank, Abbas, to internationalize this, to go to the ICC, to go to the UN, to go to these international agencies and slowly get status and eventually put Israel in an uncomfortable position. Is that a sentiment that you think is shared that's still a two-state solution, right? So, is that a sentiment that's shared, or is Abbas and the political elite basically going alone at this, and the Palestinians are just basically giving up and saying, yeah, nice try. We know that eventually the long-term solution is this binational state. What's your reflection on the ground about that?
Okay, so I think that the move to internationalize the conflict has actually always existed. Always, always, always. It was the international community that didn't really respond very well. So we do have, and you point to this, we have a new era in which Palestinians, and I'd say that's partly because of the post-Oslo period, where Palestinians are recognized and their narratives have actually been recognized to some extent, their narrative of displacement, the 1947 Nakba, all of those sorts of things have become more commonplace, if you will.
Yeah.
And so not every Palestinian is automatically labeled as a terrorist, which was the case, and certainly in the 1970s, and right up until even Oslo. And even through the Oslo period, we had some people suggesting, as Yoni has said, we're not going to make peace with our enemies. So internationalizing the conflict and calling for international intervention has actually been more commonplace than not within the Palestinian community, I would say. I think Abbas has taken it upon himself, or the Palestinian Authority has gone as far as it can actually go. I'm not sure how much further this is going to go, whether or not the Security Council resolution, those sorts of things. I'm just not sure where that will take us. With respect to the two-state solution, I have said this for a very long time, and I hate to have to say this again, but I think it's a mirage. And it's not because I want it to be a mirage, but because I think that's what we're seeing happen. The right and the left both speak about a two-state solution. The international community speaks about a two-state solution. And yet, in the very period in which the two-state solution has become a legitimate, refrain, if you will, because prior, again, to Oslo, you couldn't say two-state solution either. But now you say two-state solution, everyone says, yes, okay. It's not just that we haven't quite figured out how we're going to get there, but in fact, in the intervening years since the two-state solution has been adopted by the international community, we've seen growing settlements, we've seen several wars, We've seen ever-growing militarization, actually, of the conflict on the Palestinian side, not just on the Israeli side. We've seen thousands more people either wounded or killed in these wars. So in this period of the two-state solution as, the resolution, we have seen more destruction and more deadly conflict, I would say. And so, if we could come up with a two-state solution and we could actually enforce the thing, that may move us in the direction of, greater stability, human rights, fewer abrogations of human rights. We get rid of the settlers punishing Palestinians simply for existing, that kind of thing. But I don't see us going in that direction. And I see not only a movement, like, as Yoni notes, on the right for a one state. You are now starting to see people from the right and the left beginning to discuss just what that could look like. And that may not be either right or left, right? We're talking about communitarian politics, we're talking about collectivism. There are all kinds of other things happening here that are related to new religious movements, actually, as we were talking about earlier, and the appeal that that holds for people. So for Jews living in the West Bank as religious Jews, and what is the appeal of living on the land? That kind of thing actually holds a lot of weight.
Yeah, Yoni has an intervention,
I do want
please.
to add to
Yeah.
Jasmin's extremely important point. What Israel is going through currently is this cultural, not exactly cultural war as much as cultural debate, in which the Ashkenazi, i.e. European character of Israeli identity, of Israeli culture, is being eroded in favor of a more inclusive, which basically means more Arab notions, because the Jews originating from Muslim countries and Arab countries within that are demanding a greater impact on the culture, a greater representation. The non-Jewish Israelis demanding their share of the public space and so forth. So gradually we do see an Arabization of Israel happening at the same time as this move to the right. And
That's so interesting.
And in the long run, it will make a one-state solution far more plausible.
Right.
Because above all, it is the narcissism of little differences. Above all, it's really a country in which it's very easy to imagine this as one country with. Yeah.
Well, and this is something I know we've talked about, that, Iraqi music is what's being sold on the streets. It's, and again, I've talked about this in my class, we know so much of the narrative of the Palestinians that, we had this exodus or this kicking out, depending on your narrative, of 750,000, but there's also 750,000 Arab Jews who also left the Middle East, and many of them came to Israel. So there is this really interesting, this Arabization, for lack of a better term. I almost think of it almost as, they've become really a part of the neighborhood and culture, right? Because so much of the cultural values and the cultural, everything from the music to the food, I mean, we know the food is a big deal too, has become very Middle Eastern. So it's quite interesting. David?
Just a couple of comments on this. I mean, I admit my bias. I'm an old-fashioned liberal. I'd like to see a two-state solution, liberal, democratic on both sides, each with the Palestinian or Jewish identity and mutually secure. I fear you may be right, both of you, in terms of the direction. If that's the case, then here are a number of impediments. First of all, we are increasingly hearing not only the one state from the right-wing Israeli, but you're hearing it, or the left-wing Israeli sometimes, but you're hearing the one state from the Palestinian.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And as you hear it from the Israeli one state, you either hear it as a nationalist call or as a religious call. At the moment, as I read it, and I may be wrong here, most of the one state from the Palestinian is influenced by Islam, a religious call. There is a small nationalist side to it, but it's secondary. Now that may change. Second point is that one of the things that we too readily overlook is that the Israelis and the Palestinian Authority have, in spite of all their differences, for mutual benefit worked out in a very effective security cooperation arrangement. It's the only way Abbas and his team stay in power and stay alive, and it enhances Israel's confidence that there's some stability in the West Bank, and that's important. The third is the most recent change, and that, of course, is what we talked about in the wonderful panels the rest of the day today. When, it used to be said somewhat with a perverse smile, well, the problem with Israel, it lives in a bad neighborhood. It's a democracy that lives in a bad neighborhood. Well, now, if that was a bad neighborhood,
it's really bad.
From an Israeli, if you speak to Israeli senior military leaders, strategic and security people, they first and foremost do two things, and I've always been amazed by this. They are probably the most articulate individuals about the value of a liberal democracy. And at the same time, they're the most articulate and forceful individuals who say that for now at least, what is best for us are strong, stable, and if it has to be authoritarian regimes in the Arab world, because at least there's some degree of predictability, containment, and we can deal with them on a diplomatic basis. The turmoil creates huge senses of insecurity, and Israelis, who right now are flourishing in a remarkably robust economy, are saying, well, look, it's their problem, it's their world they're making a mess of, we will simply become a garrison state if that's what it takes. And for those of you who haven't gone back to your political science of 35 or 40 years ago, there was a whole literature on the garrison state. And the garrison state will assure our economic, not just viability, but growth, sustainability. We've got offshore energy resources. We are the leading country in the world in patents, in intellectual property. Our ties with Europe, North America, Japan, and Korea, and India are getting deeper and deeper and deeper, and now the Chinese that used to play games with us are now deeply after us to share all kinds of things and invest.
Which might be a game changer.
It absolutely could be.
Because once China really feels that its interests lies with a secure, stable Israel, as it increasingly is, then Israel really enhanced its power of international.
And right through the 1990s, the largest PLO embassy in the world was in Beijing.
Well, it's so interesting that, very recently, you had Netanyahu first going to China, or I should say, first went Abbas, and then a week later, Netanyahu. I mean, there is this pivoting to Asia, but, back to sort of the international level, the Chinese also don't want to get involved in this. I mean, they're unlike the Americans who have a vested sort of political history in at least pretending to be, the broker. I don't see the Chinese really interested, other than doing business, which they're doing very well with the Israelis.
For business, you need stability. Yeah. Hence, you will block anything that will destabilize the region.
And the Chinese, if you look, they're getting more and more involved with the Gulf states. They want to find ways to get involved with Turkey, if for no other reason to do an end run around Russia in that part. It has to do with pipelines that go across Central Asia. And with the Gulf, it helps them give blue water fleet access to Africa, which is their source of commodities. So there's a huge interest, and the Chinese have been one of the major investors, even though it's a struggling economy and a long way to go, in Egypt.
Well, it's interesting because I think that we see both the Israelis and the Palestinians turn away from Washington. Right? I mean, for so long, the Americans were the place you would go to. Now, some might say that, the Kerry, which I think shuttle diplomacy 10 times to try and broker a peace treaty. I mean, he really gave it his all. I mean, you can't fault him for not trying. But some would say outside of John Kerry and John Kerry alone, the rest of the United States, particularly the administration, didn't really invest a lot in trying to broker a peace treaty. So in some way, I think both the Israelis and the Palestinians kind of gave up on the Americans being either there's their backer, in the case of the Israelis, right? Often they looked at the Americans to really back them on everything, and they literally feel lately, particularly with their negotiations with Iran, that somehow the Americans are no longer their backers, so they're going to go it alone. But similarly, the Palestinians no longer look at the Americans as seeing any sense of urgency in this, and increasingly they're saying, we're going to go to the international route and fight for this through the diplomatic channels.
Yeah. You go ahead.
So, I mean, I think part of any move to rely on the Americans has also failed for the Palestinians anyway, right? So during the last two wars, certainly the Gaza wars, there was no protection for the Palestinians. There's, in fact, they continue to militarize. So I think the Palestinians are well aware of even entering into negotiations with the Americans means that the concessions will be such that this is not an honest broker, as they say, right? So, there are real costs to going in on this with the Americans alone. On the other hand, all these security arrangements that David's talked about are underwritten in part by the Americans, right, in the West Bank, certainly. So it's this...
And with the Egyptians containing Gaza.
On the Gaza side. So I just wanted to get back to one of the things that David mentioned, though. I think, and something that Yoni, all of us have sort of said in some ways, is that the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza and within the state of Israel, and never mind the ones living in the refugee camps, all of them are very, very different, and they have very different political histories now, and access to power and access to opportunity. The West Bank Palestinians are, their relationship to Israel right now, or Israelis, never mind Israel, is basically through the military, right? So the only contact the Palestinians have with Israelis at this point, or most of them, is at the checkpoints and through military. Gaza, obviously, the same thing. It's even more violent. But Palestinians within the state of Israel, with whom I think the Oslo people should have spoken, actually, because the Palestinians within the state of Israel certainly do understand Israeli political culture and do understand the history and do have had obviously long histories of engagement with Israeli and Israeli Jews and Bedouin and others and Druze. So they should have been the ones that should have been at the table. And I think this is another error, if you will, within the international arena, if I can make such a statement, that you keep going off in all these different directions to all these different people. And what about the people who are most affected on the ground? What about including them and their voices? And I think there have been many, many, many missed opportunities there as well.
Do you think the West Bank Palestinians, and I'm going to ask Bree to kind of come in on this as well, do you think the West Bank Palestinians believe that there is going to be something achieved through the internationalization of this, or are they more in favor of the Barghouti option, which we've talked about in our class, which is, seeing this, let the one-state solution come to fruition by letting this all fizzle out, give back the control of the territories to the Israelis and make them basically deal with it, and eventually that will be the birth of a one-state solution. What do you think are the sentiment of Palestinians?
Again, I think it depends on where they're living. So those who are most affected by the settlement practices are desperate for outside intervention, and they want it now and yesterday and the day before. Those who are least affected, and partly elites, are, waiting for things to happen because they're actually not doing so badly, right? Economically, they're not doing so badly.
Interesting.
So I think you'd have to, talk about where and when and under what conditions.
Bree?
Yeah, I agree completely with what Jasmin said, and the people who are experiencing day-to-day violence because of settlers or because of the army are very much committed to documenting, for example, human rights issues. There's lots of programs now, and Palestinians are feeling very empowered to, collect this data, and with the intention that this may one day go to the ICC. This might, I can send it to this organization, and so there's a feeling of going through those international channels, I think is a really optimistic and hopeful thing for a lot of Palestinians on the ground. But like Jasmin said, it's also has to do with people whose day-to-day lives are affected by violence. There's definitely, Palestinians who are very comfortable and who are, doing okay, and so that's not as much of a concern. The other issue though is this. that I think is coming out that I wanted to mention is this knowledge of the other and not having contact. And you mentioned it, we've all talked a bit about it, but I think it's so in your face when you're there. It's so obvious, and then when you talk to people, it also comes out. I went to the settlements in the West Bank and just talked and chatted with some settlers and asked them about their experiences with Palestinians. Oh, I've never met a Palestinian. I mean, that was really the sentiment, and those were the exact words that a lot of people said. Oh, I don't care about the Palestinians. Those were some college kids at one of the Israeli university in the settlements. I interviewed a woman, an economic settler, and asked her about what was going on. What did she think about what's going on in the West Bank and with Palestinians? And she's like, oh, I try not to think about it. I don't want my kids to know about it. We just get in our car, we drive into Israel, we come back to the this kind of thing. So this was this kind of really stuck out in my mind, and it goes the same way. It's the same way with Palestinians. I'll just give an anecdote. My research assistant was Palestinian. She was helping me to translate and introduce me to the families. And one of the families we were interviewing, we were connected through an Israeli human rights organization. My research assistant was really, really nervous to meet an Israeli. She'd never met an Israeli before. And we sat and talked about it for a while. What are your fears? What do you think is going to happen? And so forth. And she was really nervous, you could tell. And I told her, you don't have to do this, it's okay, but let's talk about it, let's see how it goes. And then when she met this woman who was amazing, amazing Israeli woman doing this human rights work with Bedouin, and she said, I'm just blown away. I'm so amazed that I had that experience to meet this woman, because I've never met an Israeli before, and I didn't know that they were like this, that they cared. So I think that I'm coming from this very micro level perspective of breaking down these barriers, breaking down these walls, literally and figuratively. Judy Rodorin in the New York Times wrote down that Israel's embraced a castle mentality of kind of, not just the walls, but also policies and so forth. And I think for anything to be achieved, to move forward, there have to be those conversations, there has to be those, breaking down that castle mentality. And I could say the same thing, I could argue the same thing is probably true for Palestinians as well, so, yeah.
Yeah, Yoni.
So first of all, here for what you just said, those initiatives died out. They were very prominent during the Oslo years.
Seeds of Peace movement that we talked about in our class.
So we did hikes for peace, and we played football for peace, and now we don't do those things anymore. I did want to, with regard to the international and the internationalization of the conflict, I think that we must remember that there is also the stake of the international organizations themselves and the ICC and so forth. And I think that there is no doubt that there is a case that claims could be made in favor of the Palestinian cause and so forth. I think that Professor Howard-Hassman's upcoming book presents a whole chapter in which you really see a very fine, elaborate examples of the claims you can make in the ICC. However, when you'll have this match between hard, real politics, international politics, and international law and international conventions, who will win? And I think that it's a big danger. It's a danger for those international institutions to risk their status, to risk their prestige by really taking in such a contested issue. And I think that this is a fascinating moment to really see, because is the UN capable of seeing it through? Because if they won't be able to see it through, if the ICC will not be able to see it through, then we will have this public disavowal of this fine, emerging international rule of law. And I think that it must be taken into consideration. And currently, Israeli diplomacy is aiming exactly at that, in really suggesting, don't risk it. Don't risk it. We are powerful enough to make sure that this won't work. And if it won't work, the prices will be too high to pay. And I think that while I'm deeply sad that this is so, I think that Israel is very prudent doing exactly that. This is why we see the current foreign minister, vice foreign minister, which is this unbelievably loud, high fervor settler, Tzipi Khotubeli, and the Ministry of Law is this unbelievably loud. Both are young, unbelievably talented women. This really tour de force of what Israel can produce. Young, not coming from the elite by origin, unbelievably talented, unbelievably intelligent, ridiculously evil in terms of supporting Ayn Rand and really having this, you read the interviews and it's frightening, but they are very powerful.
And xenophobic.
They don't like the other. But they put forward a very interesting message in terms of rule of law and in terms of international relations. And I think that it's something to note.
Interesting. Yeah, please, David.
Yoni and I did not coordinate, but I've got a quote I have to read you that comes right from this.
Into the mic, David.
A quote. So this is from the ICC prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, who wrote in a Guardian op-ed, I quote, "It's my firm belief that recourse to justice should never be compromised by political expediency. The failure to uphold this sacrosanct requirement will not only pervert the cause of justice and weaken public confidence in it, but also exacerbate the immense suffering of the victims of mass atrocities. This we will never allow. If the ICC wants to be taken seriously and not be viewed like the Geneva-based UN Human Rights Council, which regards Israel as an obsession at a time when more than 200,000 Syrians have been slaughtered, it should remain true to its origins and avoid politicization by inserting itself into a complex conflict such as the Israeli-Palestinian issue." And then last week, Stephen Toop, currently the new director of the Monk School, former president of UBC, former dean of law at McGill, and one of the UN's leading experts on the UN and human rights, in a lecture to Israelis, when asked about international institutions and international law, basically his response was, you know your way around the system. You know that for years and for years to come, through the UN, through various agencies of the UN, Israel is going to be vilified, ostracized, not treated as it should as a member state. It's going to develop, it's going to continue to do this, but if it's necessary for Israel not to give up in the UN because it's too important an institution, and let it evolve. But I find it interesting that the prosecutor is concerned that, of course, one of the main sources where Israel does feel victimized is the UN Commission on Human Rights, now the UN Council of Human Rights. And so Stephen Toop is saying something important to Israelis who I think, Yoni, you might agree, have grown up with a real sense of skepticism would be a nice way of putting it, towards the UN as a system, even though they may have some of the leading experts in international law. They know how to play lawfare just as the Palestinians want to play lawfare. And so where this works, I don't know. But I too, as Yoni said, I'd be concerned that as the Israelis push this, and I think Jasmin was right, the internationalization has been there for all these years. And it's been there within the context of the UN for all these years. But if the Palestinian Authority plays this card too hard, it could backfire in many ways that we don't yet realize, including the further devaluing of the UN system.
But, you know, there's also, I mean, to give you a counter-argument, too, I mean, there is a frustration where much of the Palestinians would say that, you know, we've been in this wheel of a process. This process, you can't have negotiations for the sake of just negotiating. I mean, there has to be an outcome, right? And one of the things that I think was actually refreshing from Netanyahu was that finally he showed his true colors. I mean, he does not want to see his two-state solution. So finally admitted it. He definitely backed off, and not just him, but his advisors. That's what someone says in the midst of an election. But I think it finally, it took off the, what Palestinians have been arguing for a long time is basically this obsession of Israelis to just keep talking, talk for the sake of talk, with no real desire to get to an outcome, and that being the two-state solution.
I think that
Yoni.
in that, and Israel has been extremely really seeing things as they are. Israel understood that there is no reason to solve things, that we live in an era of everlasting transitions. We live in an era in which situations are in a state of exception, they are not as they should be, and they will remain not as they should be for eternity and beyond. Why would you ever, this is and in South Africa, the Afrikaners keep on speaking about that. Why did we negotiate so fast? 20 years after, Israel is still negotiating. And if you can perpetuate the process, why would you solve it?
But Yoni, you're absolutely right, except that the West, and I think the West Bank Palestinians may be, a little less, and maybe Bree and Jasmin can jump in on this, they may not be chopping at the bits nearly as fast, but people in Gaza are definitely feeling the reality of what occupation is, and it's horrific. So there's also, I think that you're right to say that for the Israelis, and I think that's really important, that, the Israeli calculus has been, let's keep the status quo for as long as possible, right? But I think that what is not part of the calculation in that, and just to point out, the last election, the word Palestinian was never brought, the whole concept, can you imagine, we're so fixated on the Palestinian-Israeli issue, but in the last election, a few months ago, the issue of making peace with the Palestinians was not even an item in the conversation of the entire election campaign, which is just shows you that it's complete blinders for the average Israeli. But the situation in Gaza is desperate, and that's a powder keg, right? My question to both Bree and Jasmin, who have probably more insight into what's going on the ground in Palestine, and particularly the West Bank and Gaza, is there a tipping point there? Am I wrong to think that maybe West Bank is not nearly as crucial? It's not nearly as dire, but Gaza is, and that's not going away. We still see the tit for tat going on just in the past week. Sorry, Jasmin and then Bree.
So for me, I think Gaza is actually the most depressing part
Absolutely.
of this story, because I think that, again, we've watched two terrible wars, and before that we've got the siege, and before that we had an election, which is now no longer an election because it's no longer considered legitimate. We've got all of these movements, and we've not only delegitimized an entire process that we apparently were part of instigating or initiating. We've now left these people to die, to starve, to die, to deal with the instability of the kind of government that, yes, okay, they chose, but it wasn't as though they had a whole lot of choice. The PA is probably not a whole lot better in so many respects, but it's more stable, and there are, again, relationships with Israel which stabilize some of the security situations. But, the international siege against Gaza, what is that about, right? Except choking off these people and essentially putting them in a state of desperation. And now that we've militarized the conflict, I think that the situation is ever more dire there. So for me, the international community has failed on the Gaza front entirely and completely. And that's not Israel's issue in a way, right? Israel's claim is we disengaged. Of course, and again, I think this is where international law and international human rights law kind of clash, because you've got these laws of war, and then you've got the laws of humanity or humanitarian laws. And these things are not meeting at all. And the international community is not responding to the Gazans at all. And I think with respect, just to move back to how Israeli Jews are doing, and some of the things David was saying, and your point about the election, on the Jewish side of my family, people are constantly talking about how it is that things are unstable. The economy is an issue.
Housing,
huge
problem.
The fact that people don't have full-time jobs. You have, again, an educated class, Ashkenazim in my family, who don't have great positions, who don't hold great positions. In the past, that was a social contract, right? You did this, you did that, you were good soldiers, physically, and and out of that came the prospects of a career. And now that's not happening. People are holding down 2 or 3 jobs. My cousin's husband is now in the military as full-time work, which was very unusual for that class in some ways. So these things are also having an impact on how people see
Absolutely.
the future and how Jews see the future, Israeli Jews see the future.
Bree, jump in, and then I'm going to give David last word, and we're going to wrap up.
Sure. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm pretty much going to echo what Jasmin said. I mean, Gaza is just such a different context than West Bank, and it's grown further and further apart as the years go by. When you have the conflict, what happened in Gaza last summer, these things happen and the drums start beating and people say we have to do something, and then it ends, and then we don't hear anything. And then maybe a few months later we get a report from the UN acknowledging that Israel, did something wrong, and things aren't happening. It's kind of like a cycle is what I'm seeing. And I think that the people I interviewed also were seeing this as a cycle. It was interesting in the West Bank, though, because the West Bank people in the West Bank, Palestinians in the West Bank, were dealing with the different challenges. They were dealing with the challenges of the Palestinian Authority, and they would say Palestinian Authority is repeating some of the tactics that they experienced under the Israeli army, and so they were seeing the Palestinian Authority as another extension of the occupation. But it was also a normalization of the occupation, so it's become kind of these day-to-day activities where people are continuing with their lives. They're building their buildings, they're going to work, they're going to school, they're having babies, but there's still like this tension of violence that exists there. And one other point that came out in a lot of the interviews is how sad the West Bank Palestinians felt for the Gazan Palestinians. And when you have a population in the West Bank that's, I think it's about 70% living under the poverty line in the West Bank, which is about $2 a day, feeling sorry for the situation of the Gazans, I mean, it says something there in terms of the division. So I'm really interested in your work and the connection between these different kinds of groups of Palestinians in all different places and how they connect when they're not connected, physically. It's interesting.
Yeah, fascinating. David?
Yeah, just three quick comments. On Jasmin's point on the economy, you're absolutely right. And in fact, while the Israeli economy in its fullness and those areas around innovation are booming, the Gini coefficient and other indicators of the gap between wealth and poverty is expanding dramatically, just as it is in the United States. I think it's actually more extreme in the United States. But it does mean that Jasmin's comments about the decrease in the access to services available to Israeli Jews is significant, and that is likely to trickle down and mean that it's even worse for Palestinian Israelis. Second, really, is that, and this is the counterfactual, and the counterfactual, of course, is that when you think about what Rabin was about to achieve before he was assassinated, what he was going to do with the West Bank, and the counterfactual about what Ariel Sharon was about to do in Gaza before he went into a coma. I mean, that's a tragedy if we believe the counterfactual suggests that these two people who are probably the last two individuals who really had stature across the broadest range of Israeli political society, both were cut short, one by health and one by right-wing Israeli fanatic, a Jewish nationalist, and both of them had credibility because they were both military heroes, they had been politically active, they'd served overseas. So the counterfactual here is really a sad tale because we don't know what might have happened.
And as many say, a proof of divine will.
Yes,
But
those
this
who
is
are.
a common argument.
Oh, that's
in
right.
Israel.
Really?
And this is not just a
Absolutely.
funny provocation. It's
That's
also
right.
a
That's
common
right.
argument, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And again, last point then. I mean, I do think that the not the economic settlers, because the economic settlers can be relocated easily. The religious nationalist settlers in the West Bank is the time bomb that is going to affect both Palestinian society and Israeli society. Israel is absolutely secure from external enemies. It's not secure from that kind of a provocation.
Wow.
Or the Palestinians, for that matter.
Wow, right? We're just scratching the surface. I want to thank you. This is fantastic. Really appreciate all of your comments, and we could go on and really keep talking till tomorrow and only literally scratch the surface of what we want to talk about. So thank you so much for that. So I just want to thank you all for coming. Really appreciate you sticking it right through. Very important. Please, 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 what I hope that you take from today is that, and I've said this to my class, so you're hearing me say it all over again, is that these are issues that can never be summarized. As you saw on each one of our panels, it's so complicated, right? All of these issues are not easily discussed in slogans, and yet we have, unfortunately, when we talk about Middle East politics, had this unfortunate way of giving everything a binary, dichotomous view, and we don't see the nuance and the subtlety and the reality that things are pretty complex on the ground. So this is just to encourage you to keep reading, keep the conversation going. Come to your classes, read your books, and let's keep the conversation going. Quick, if you don't mind, for all the students to please, let's help keep this place tidy by taking all our garbage out. And also, if I could ask some of the chairs at the very end here need to go back to room 141. If you guys could help us out by returning those because they weren't supposed to be in here. And thank you to all the panelists and for all the classes. And for Melissa for bringing her class too. Thank you to the Wilfrid Laurier students here. I really appreciate you guys coming as well. Okay?